I never imagined that silence could feel so loud. When I look back now, it's clear that the quiet moments between us always carried something heavier, something unspoken, something he thought I wasn't ready to hear. But at the time, all I noticed was how he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, how he always lingered just a second longer when saying goodbye, how he memorized the small things I mentioned once and never repeated. These were the details I brushed aside, convincing myself they meant nothing. I see now how foolish that was. I see now how love can whisper long before it ever dares to speak. We met during a moment in my life when everything felt messy. I had just left a long, exhausting relationship, the kind that drains you so slowly you don't notice it's happening until you're completely empty. I wasn't looking for anything new. I wasn't looking for anyone. I just wanted peace, silence, and a chance to breathe again without the weight of someone else's expectations suffocating me. That's when he appeared, quietly, like something I didn't realize I needed until it was already there. I remember the first time we talked. It wasn't romantic or dramatic. It was simple, ordinary even. We were both waiting for coffee at the same small cafe I went to almost every day. A place with mismatched chairs, a crooked window frame, and a persistent smell of cinnamon. He stood beside me in line, holding a book with a worn cover and a folded receipt marking his place. When I glanced at the title, he noticed and shifted the book closer for me to see, as if offering something without words. I smiled politely, assuming that would be the end of it. But he said something about the author, something thoughtful, something unexpectedly warm. And before I knew it, we were talking like old friends. That day I didn't think much of him. He was kind, gentle, attentive in a way that felt comforting without being intrusive. But I had built a wall so tall around myself that nothing, not even the softness of his voice, could have climbed it. At least that's what I believed. Looking back, that was the first moment he began stitching himself into the quiet corners of my life. We ran into each other again a few days later, then again the next week, and again the week after that. Sometimes at the cafe, sometimes at the bookstore across the street, sometimes walking to the same bus stop. It was too frequent to be coincidence but too effortless to feel intentional. That's what drew me in at first, the ease. With him, nothing felt forced. Nothing felt like a performance. He seemed to exist in the spaces I didn't realize were missing someone. He never flirted. He never tried to impress me. But he cared. God, he cared in ways I wasn't used to. I was familiar with loud love, demanding love, love that needed validation, attention, applause. But his love, even before it had a name, was quiet, steady, present. There were days when he would simply sit beside me while I worked, reading his book in silence, occasionally looking up just to check if I needed anything. There were days when he walked me halfway home, even when it made him late, pretending he just happened to be heading in the same direction. And there were nights when I cried over things I didn't know were still hurting me, and he stayed even when I told him he didn't need to. He never touched me during those moments. He never crossed any line I didn't draw myself. He just sat there, patient, grounded, offering a safety I had never experienced before. I didn't understand it then, but he was trying to love me gently, responsibly, quietly. He was waiting for me to heal, even when I wasn't doing anything to help myself. For the longest time, I thought he just cared as a friend. I convinced myself he was simply a good person with a generous heart. I ignored the way his voice softened when he said my name, the way his eyes followed me when he thought I wasn't looking, the way he always positioned himself just slightly closer to me than necessary, as if drawn by something he was afraid to acknowledge out loud. I didn't let myself believe it meant anything. Maybe I didn't want to believe it, because deep down I was terrified. I was terrified that if someone loved me again, I would break them the way the past had broken me. Still, he stayed. Everything changed the night he found me crying outside the cafe, long after closing. I had received a message that shattered something inside me, a reminder from my past that still had sharp edges. I sat on the sidewalk with my knees pulled to my chest, trying to breathe through the ache that felt too familiar. When he turned the corner and saw me, he froze. Not out of fear or confusion, but because he cared so deeply it caught him off guard. He sat beside me without asking permission and placed his jacket around my shoulders. I kept apologizing between sobs, apologizing for being a mess, for not being stronger, for making him deal with something that wasn't his responsibility. He didn't say anything. Not at first. He just waited until my breathing steadied. Then he said something I will never forget. Not because the words were dramatic, but because they were delivered with such sincerity it disarmed me completely. He told me that he didn't stay because he had to. He stayed because he wanted to. Because I mattered to him. Because seeing me hurt felt like being punched in the chest. And because even if I didn't believe I deserved someone in my corner, he believed it enough for both of us. I should have realized then what was happening. I should have seen how deeply he felt everything he tried so hard to hide. But I wasn't ready. I wasn't brave enough. So instead I thanked him, promised I was fine, and pulled away. Not because I wanted distance, but because I didn't know how to accept something so kind without fearing I might ruin it. The days that followed were confusing. He didn't change the way he acted toward me. He still showed up, still listened, still walked beside me. But there was something different in the air between us. Something thicker, warmer, heavier. Like the silence between us had grown a heartbeat. And then came the day I almost lost him. It was raining harder than usual, and the streets were flooded. My phone buzzed with a message from him saying he had something important to tell me and asking if we could meet. I told him yes. Of course I said yes. I didn't know why my heart reacted the way it did reading his message, but it raced in a way it never had before. I felt nervous, expectant, afraid. I walked to the cafe slowly, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But the moment I stepped inside and saw him soaked from the rain, hair dripping, hands trembling slightly, I knew it wasn't nothing. I knew something was about to shift. He looked at me with an expression I had never seen on him before. Terrified hope. Like he had been rehearsing something for days only to forget every word the moment he saw me. Before he could speak, the power went out. The entire street went dark. The rain hammered against the windows so loudly it drowned out everything else. And there we were, standing inches apart, illuminated only by the faint glow from the streetlights outside. He opened his mouth to speak, but I stepped back. I didn't mean to. It was instinct, fear, habit. But the moment he saw me flinch, something inside him shut down. Completely. He apologized, whispered that it could wait, and hurried out into the storm before I had the chance to say anything. I chased after him, but he disappeared into the rain like he was running from his own confession. That night he didn't message me. The next day he didn't show up anywhere I expected him to. The cafe, the bookstore, the bus stop. Nowhere. It was like he had vanished. For the first time I felt what it was like to miss him. Not the quiet, comfortable absence of someone you enjoy. It was a sharp, desperate ache that pressed against my ribs. I kept checking my phone, waiting for a message that never came. I kept replaying the moment I flinched, the moment he saw my fear and mistook it for rejection. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't focus. The silence he left behind was unbearable. That's when I realized how deeply he had been woven into my life. How many of my smiles were because of him. How many of my calm days were built around the quiet stability he gave me. How many of my thoughts included him without me even noticing. I started to understand, and it terrified me all over again. 3 days passed without a word from him. On the 4th day, I finally found him. He was sitting alone at the park, leaning on a bench, staring at the lake like he was trying to disappear into the stillness. His eyes looked tired, distant, as if he had been carrying the weight of something he didn't know how to put down. He didn't notice me at first. I stood there watching him, realizing this was the first time I'd seen him look anything other than quietly strong. He looked breakable, and the sight of it crushed me. When he finally looked up and saw me, his expression shifted into something unreadable. Surprise, relief, fear, hope, all tangled together. I sat beside him without asking. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was uncomfortable for the first time, heavy with everything unspoken. I told him I was sorry, not for flinching, but for running emotionally long before he ever tried to reach me. I told him I wasn't afraid of him, only of what he made me feel. Because he made me feel safe, and that was something I hadn't felt in years. Something I didn't know how to accept. He listened, shoulders tense, jaw tight, hands gripping the edge of the bench as if bracing himself. When I finally asked him why he disappeared, he looked down and exhaled shakily. And then he told me everything. He told me he loved me. Not in a dramatic burst, not in a desperate plea, but in the softest, most painful confession I had ever heard. He said he had loved me quietly from the start, In every small moment I never noticed, in every little gesture I assumed was nothing. He said he tried to hold it back because he didn't want to pressure me, because he knew I was healing, because he would rather stay silent forever than risk scaring me away. But when he saw me flinch that night, he thought he had already lost me. He said disappearing felt like the only way to protect me from the weight of his feelings. Hearing him say those words felt like something inside me broke open. All the walls I had built, all the fears I clung to, all the reasons I convinced myself I wasn't ready, they all fell apart in seconds. I wanted to tell him everything I had realized. I wanted to tell him how losing him for just 3 days felt unbearable. I wanted to tell him how his silence had become something I needed, how his presence had become the safest place I knew. But before I could speak, something unexpected happened. He looked at me with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of every moment he kept hidden. Before I could tell him everything I had realized, he whispered something so faint I almost didn't hear it. He said he needed time. Not to rethink his feelings, but to understand whether he deserved a place in my life after causing me pain, even unintentionally. Those words struck me like a jolt. The idea that he believed he had hurt me, that he thought disappearing was an act of protection, made something inside me tighten painfully. I told him he didn't hurt me. I told him it was my own fear that made everything look like danger, even when it came from someone who had only ever shown me gentleness. But he shook his head softly, like he had already convinced himself he had crossed a line he could never erase. I could see the conflict inside him, see the way he tried to pull away even though every part of him was leaning toward me. The tension between us became so thick it felt almost visible, like the air itself held its breath. I reached for his hand without thinking. Not a dramatic gesture, not a desperate one. Just a simple touch, quiet and honest, like the way he had loved me all along. He froze the second our skin met. His eyes flicked to my hand, then to my face, as though he couldn't understand what was happening. I told him he didn't need to disappear. I told him I wasn't afraid anymore. I told him I finally understood the silence he had carried for so long. And for the first time since I'd known him, he looked at me with naked vulnerability, unguarded and trembling. He asked me why I wasn't afraid anymore, why I came looking for him, why I cared. Those questions weren't simple. They came from a place that had suffered in silence, from a heart that had loved without expecting anything in return. It was the kind of love that asks for confirmation not because it doubts the other person, but because it doubts its own worth. So I answered honestly. I told him that the 3 days without him felt emptier than all the months before I met him. I told him that silence without him was unbearable. I told him that I didn't realize how deeply he had rooted himself in my life until he wasn't there. He didn't say anything. He just stared at me with an expression that made my chest tighten. It was hope, disbelief, longing, fear, all of it blending into something raw and fragile. When he finally spoke again, his voice cracked. He said he didn't want to be someone I chose out of absence or loneliness. He wanted to be someone I chose because I wanted him, because I saw him the way he saw me. And I realized then that his silence had been his armor, a way to love without expecting anything back, because expecting anything scared him more than staying quiet. I told him I wasn't choosing him out of absence. I was choosing him because he had become the safest place I knew. I was choosing him because he loved me quietly, patiently, consistently. And for the first time, I wanted to love someone back in the same way. His breath caught. His eyes softened. But still, he hesitated. He said he was afraid of being wrong for me. Afraid that he would love me too much, too deeply, too quietly, and that one day I would realize it wasn't enough. He said he didn't know how to love loudly, that he wasn't like the people from my past who made grand gestures and dramatic declarations. He didn't know how to compete with that kind of intensity. That was the moment something inside me clicked. I told him I didn't want loud. I told him loud had only ever left bruises on me, emotional ones that lingered for years. I told him that quiet love wasn't weakness, it was strength. The kind of strength that stays, listens, understands. The kind that heals instead of hurts. For the first time since I'd known him, he allowed himself to breathe. He didn't say anything immediately. He just stayed still, holding my hand like it was something fragile, something he wasn't sure he had the right to keep. Then very slowly he intertwined his fingers with mine. It was a small gesture, but I felt everything in it. Every fear, every hope, every unspoken word he had carried for so long. He whispered that he didn't want to rush me, that he didn't want to start something only for one of us to break halfway through, that he had waited this long in silence, and he could wait longer if that was what I needed. I looked at him and realized he wasn't unwilling to speak. He was afraid that speaking his heart out loud would ruin everything. So I told him the truth. I told him I wanted him. Not someday. Not maybe. Not later. Now. The shock on his face was almost painful to look at. It was like he had spent months convincing himself that the possibility of being loved back was unrealistic, impossible, a dream he was too afraid to acknowledge. And now that I was saying the words out loud, his brain couldn't keep up with the reality unfolding in front of him. He whispered my name like it was a prayer he never expected to say out loud. His voice shook, and I felt the tremor run through his fingers still holding mine. He told me he didn't know what to do next. He wasn't being dramatic. He genuinely didn't know. He had prepared himself for silence, for distance, for heartbreak. But he had never prepared for the possibility that I might step toward him instead of away. So I took a breath, leaned closer, and closed the gap between us just enough for him to understand I wasn't going anywhere. He inhaled sharply. His eyes flicked from my lips to my eyes like he was begging for permission without daring to ask. I nodded gently, and it was like something inside him finally broke free. But he didn't kiss me. He cupped the side of my face with trembling fingers, his touch feather-light, as if afraid I might disappear if he pressed too firmly. He whispered that he needed to be sure, that he needed to know I wasn't acting on emotion or fear or confusion. He said he had dreamed of this moment too many times to allow it to happen for the wrong reasons. I told him I had never been clearer about anything in my life. He closed his eyes, exhaled deeply, and leaned his forehead against mine. His breath mingled with mine, soft and warm, and in that moment, I felt something shift inside both of us. Something fragile became whole. Something quiet finally found its voice. When his lips finally touched mine, it wasn't the kind of kiss people write stories about. It wasn't forceful or hungry or desperate. It was gentle, careful, reverent, like he was memorizing the moment in slow motion, afraid that if he rushed it, it would stop being real. I felt every emotion he had kept hidden for months. Every fear, every hope, every piece of love he hadn't dared to speak. And for the first time in a long time, I felt myself open to someone without holding anything back. When we pulled apart, he didn't rush to speak. He didn't declare anything loudly. He didn't try to make the moment bigger than it already was. He just looked at me with a softness so deep it left me breathless. He asked me one question, the only question that mattered. He asked if I wanted to try, to really try, to see where this quiet, trembling, tender love could lead us. He said he didn't need promises, only honesty. And I told him yes. We sat together in the silence that followed, but it wasn't the silence of fear or uncertainty. It was the silence of beginning, the silence of two hearts learning how to speak to each other. In the days that followed, everything felt both familiar and new. He still walked me home, still listened, still paid attention to the smallest details. But now he let himself speak through touch, through moments, through little admissions he used to swallow back. He would brush a strand of hair from my face, and his fingers would linger. He would look at me and then look away too quickly, blushing like the truth of his feelings startled him every time. He would reach for my hand cautiously, as if still unsure whether he was allowed to want that. And yet he never rushed anything. He never pushed. He still loved quietly, even now that his heart had spoken out loud. And I realized that this was exactly what I needed. Not intensity, not noise, not drama, but steadiness, care, presence. There was one night I will never forget. We were sitting outside, the city lights flickering like scattered stars. He was telling me about a childhood memory, something simple, something small, and then he stopped mid-sentence. Not because he forgot what he was saying, but because he suddenly looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. It was awe, like he couldn't believe I was really there with him, choosing him, wanting him. He reached for my hand slowly, almost shyly, and whispered that he still wakes up afraid that this is temporary. That one day I'll realize I deserve someone louder, more confident, more certain. Someone who doesn't hesitate. Someone who doesn't love in quiet, trembling ways. I squeezed his hand and told him that loud love had never given me peace. That noise had only ever left me wounded. That his quiet love wasn't weakness. It was strength that didn't need to shout. It was safety that didn't need to demand. It was everything I never knew I needed until it was right in front of me. I watched the relief wash over his face, the way his shoulders dropped, the way his eyes softened, the way he leaned into me like he was finally allowing himself to believe he was enough. As the weeks passed, I began to notice the ways he loved differently. He didn't overwhelm. He didn't compete. He didn't try to control the pace of anything. He was patient in all the ways I never realized I needed someone to be. He listened more than he spoke, but when he did speak, it mattered. He remembered the tiny things I said in passing. He paid attention to details I didn't know I revealed. He chose words carefully, thoughtfully, like each one carried weight. And in his silence, he showed a level of devotion I had never experienced before. There were moments when his fears resurfaced, moments when he pulled back slightly, uncertain if he was doing things right, uncertain if he was loving me the way I needed to be loved. But every time I reached for him, every time I reminded him that I chose him not in spite of his quiet heart, but because of it. And slowly, I watched him grow into someone who believed he could be loved out loud, even if he loved in whispers. The turning point came on a night that felt almost ordinary. We were sitting in my living room, sharing takeout, laughing about something neither of us would remember the next day. The air was warm, the kind of warmth that only comes from comfort, familiarity, and a sense of belonging that can't be forced. He looked at me, and I knew immediately something was different. His eyes had that same terrified hope I had seen the night he tried to confess everything, but this time he didn't look away. He took a slow breath, set his food aside, and moved closer to me. Then he said something I didn't expect. He told me he loved me, not quietly, not cautiously, not trembling. He said it with a steady, clear voice, as if he had finally learned what it felt like to speak without fear. His eyes didn't waver. His hands didn't shake. His silence wasn't armor anymore. He told me he loved me not because he had been afraid to lose me, but because he had finally learned he was allowed to want something for himself. He told me he loved me because being with me didn't feel like walking on fragile ground anymore. Felt like home. I felt tears sting my eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that the man who had loved me quietly was now learning to love me out loud. And he was doing it because I had created a space where his heart could speak without fear. I told him I loved him too, and it felt like something inside both of us settled into place. A truth that had always been there, finally spoken aloud. From that moment, everything changed in subtle ways. He became more confident, more open, more certain in the way he held me, touched me, spoke to me. But he never stopped loving quietly. He simply added a new layer to it. One that was brave, intentional, and unashamed. And as our relationship grew, I realized that quiet love is not weak. Quiet love is powerful in ways loud love could never be. Quiet love stays. Quiet love listens. Quiet love learns. Quiet love grows at its own pace and never rushes toward the finish line. He once told me that silence had always been easier for him than words. But now he speaks without fear. He tells me what he feels, what he hopes for, what he dreams about. And he does it all with the same gentle sincerity that made me fall for him in the first place. One night, as we lay together, his head resting near mine, he whispered something that made my chest tighten. He said he never expected to be loved by someone like me. Someone who had been hurt, someone who had learned to be cautious, someone who had every reason to run from vulnerability. He said that loving me felt like learning a new language, one he never thought he would be brave enough to speak fluently. I told him that loving him felt like finally understanding a language I had been hearing my whole life, but had never learned to interpret. He laughed softly, kissed my forehead, and held me close. That was when I realized just how far we had come from the first moment our paths crossed in that cafe. He had loved me quietly, so quietly I didn't hear it at first. But the day his heart finally spoke, everything changed. He taught me that love doesn't need to be loud to be real. It doesn't need grand gestures to be meaningful. Sometimes the most powerful love is the kind that waits patiently, holds gently, listens deeply, and speaks only when it's ready. And now every day his heart speaks freely. Sometimes in whispers, sometimes in laughter, sometimes in long conversations about nothing and everything at once, but always with love, always with truth, always with the quiet certainty that we found each other at exactly the right time, when his silent heart was ready to be heard, and mine was finally ready to listen. He loved me quietly, I loved him carefully, and together we learned how to speak a language we never knew we needed. Now his love is no longer silent. It beats beside mine, steady and sure. And for the first time in my life, I know that quiet love was all I ever needed.